Before we begin, if stories about family, respect, and quiet strength speak to your heart, please take a second to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And I genuinely love to know where you're watching from tonight, so leave your city, your country, and your local time down in the comments. My name is Diane Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and this was the weekend I realized my own family had already started dividing up my life before I was even gone. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand the lesson this whole nightmare taught me. And now let me tell you where it all began. I drove up to my vacation cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, expecting silence, maybe the smell of pine wood and dust after a long winter. Instead, before I even turned off the engine, I heard music thumping through the trees, loud laughter, glass bottles clinking. My stomach tightened the second I saw 6 unfamiliar SUVs packed into my gravel driveway. What in the world? I whispered to myself as I stepped out of the car holding the folder for the realtor appointment I had scheduled that afternoon. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I had spent the last 2 months preparing it for a long-term lease to help stabilize my retirement income. But when I opened the front door, warm beer smell and cigarette smoke hit me right in the face. My late husband's handmade oak table was covered with pizza boxes, liquor bottles, and someone's muddy hiking boots. Music blasted from the living room speakers, while strangers lounged across my furniture like they owned the place. One young man I'd never seen before looked over at me and laughed. "Hey, I think Grandma's home." The room erupted into chuckles. Then I saw her, Brenda, my daughter-in-law Sarah's mother. She was standing barefoot in my kitchen wearing one of my aprons, pouring wine into plastic cups like she was hosting a vacation retreat. 5 of her cousins crowded around the island laughing, while one woman dug through my refrigerator. Brenda looked up at me without even the slightest embarrassment. In fact, she smiled. "Oh, good," she said casually. "You're here. We were wondering if you could pick up more ice on your way back." I just stood there staring at her. My fingers tightened around the cabin keys so hard my knuckles hurt. "Brenda," I said quietly, "what exactly is going on here?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Sarah said we could use the place for a little family getaway." Then her smile sharpened. "Honestly, Diane, this cabin's going to belong to Sarah and Jason eventually anyway. We figured we might as well enjoy it now." A couple people laughed again. Somebody raised a beer bottle toward me like we were all sharing the same joke. And that's when I noticed Jason sitting near the fireplace, my son. He looked up at me for maybe half a second before staring back down into his drink. He didn't stand up, didn't explain, didn't tell them to leave. He just sat there in silence while strangers treated my home like a cheap rental property they'd trashed for the weekend. Something inside me went very still. I slowly walked farther into the kitchen and noticed fresh scratches carved across the surface of the oak table. My husband spent 3 winters building with his own hands after his cancer treatments. I ran my fingertips over the damaged wood without saying a word. Brenda came beside me, swirling wine in her cup. "Oh, relax." She laughed softly. "It's just furniture." I looked at the scratch marks for a long moment. Then I looked past her toward the hallway, where I suddenly noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The door to my late husband's private workshop was standing open, and I knew for a fact I had locked it before I left Charlotte. I slowly walked toward the workshop door while the music and laughter behind me started to sound strangely far away. Harold had built that little room onto the back of the cabin himself almost 20 years earlier. He used to spend entire weekends in there carving shelves, restoring old fishing lures, and listening to jazz records on a dusty radio that barely worked half the time. After he passed, I kept the room exactly the same. Same tools hanging neatly on the wall. Same flannel jacket folded over the chair. Same coffee tin full of screws labeled in his handwriting. I never even let the cleaning service touch that room. And now the door was standing wide open. I stepped inside and stopped cold. Empty beer cans sat on Harold's workbench beside greasy paper plates. Somebody had dragged 2 camping chairs into the middle of the room. One of Sarah's cousins was standing there holding Harold's old tackle box in his hands. "This thing antique or what?" He laughed toward another man sitting near the window. The second man shrugged. "Probably worth something on eBay." Neither of them even noticed my face. I took a slow breath and walked over carefully. "Please put that down," I said quietly. The cousin looked almost annoyed that I had interrupted him. "Relax," he muttered. "We were just looking around." Looking around. That room held 40 years of my marriage. I reached for the tackle box, and to my surprise, he hesitated before handing it back like somehow I was the inconvenience. "Sarah said this whole place has basically been sitting unused forever," he said casually. "Honestly, it is kind of a waste." I nodded once without answering. Because the truth was, Sarah had never understood what that cabin really was. To her, it was square footage. Investment property. Future inheritance. But to me, it was the last place Harold had ever laughed. I still remembered Jason at 12 years old running barefoot across the dock, carrying fishing poles bigger than he was. Harold teaching him how to split firewood behind the cabin, while I made chili inside the kitchen. We were never wealthy people. Harold worked 32 years maintaining freight trains for Norfolk Southern Railroad. I handled bookkeeping for a local hardware company in Charlotte. Every extra dollar we saved went into building that cabin one room at a time. Jason used to love it there. Back then, he would beg us every summer, "Can we stay one more week?" I used to think those memories meant something permanent. But standing there in that workshop, I started realizing something painful. Sarah's family did not see history when they looked around. They saw opportunity. I walked back into the kitchen where Brenda was now loudly directing people about sleeping arrangements. "The upstairs suite is ours," she announced while pointing her wine glass toward the loft. "The younger ones can take the downstairs bedrooms." Then she noticed me standing there. "Oh, Diane," she said sweetly, "would you mind washing some of these glasses? We are running low." A few people chuckled awkwardly. Jason finally stood up then, but not for me. He rubbed the back of his neck and gave me that tired little look he always used when he wanted problems to disappear without actually solving them. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we not make this into a thing right now?" I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I noticed something sitting near the fireplace, underneath Sarah's designer handbag. A thick manila folder. My folder, the one containing the cabin deed, insurance records, and rental agreement paperwork I had locked inside Harold's workshop desk drawer 6 months earlier. I kept staring at that manila folder while the noise around me blurred into the background. My first instinct was the old instinct. Smile politely. Avoid embarrassment. Wait until everyone left and quietly clean up the damage myself. That was who I had been for years. The woman who absorbed discomfort so everybody else could stay comfortable. But something about seeing my private paperwork sitting under Sarah's handbag like it belonged to the household decorations made that instinct stop cold. I walked across the room slowly and picked up the folder without saying a word. Sarah suddenly appeared from the back deck carrying a bottle of wine. The second she saw the folder in my hands, her face tightened for half a second before she forced a smile. "Oh, good," she said lightly. "I was actually looking through those rental papers earlier." I looked at her carefully. "Why?" Her tone stayed sugary sweet. "Jason and I were talking about maybe managing the property ourselves eventually. You know, keeping it in the family instead of renting it to strangers." Brenda immediately chimed in from the kitchen. "Honestly, Diane, you should enjoy retirement. This place is way too much work for somebody your age." Somebody your age. I had heard versions of that sentence more and more over the last 2 years, usually wrapped inside fake concern. Sarah walked closer and touched the folder casually with one finger. "You have to think long-term," she said. "At some point, it just makes sense for younger people to take over these kinds of responsibilities." I noticed Jason watching the conversation nervously from the fireplace. He still would not look me directly in the eyes. I waited for him to say something. Anything. Maybe Mom still owns the cabin. Maybe Sarah should not have gone through private papers. Maybe even this has gotten out of hand. Instead, he rubbed his hands together and muttered, "Everybody's just trying to help." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a lock clicking into place. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. "Nobody touches my paperwork again," I said calmly. The room went oddly silent for a second. Sarah blinked at me like she had not expected resistance. "Diane, come on," she laughed awkwardly. "Why are you acting so defensive?" Normally, I would have softened right there. I would have apologized for the tension even when I was the one being disrespected, but I did not. I simply walked past her into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Empty wine bottles crowded every shelf. Somebody had shoved Harold's homemade peach preserves behind a case of beer. I picked up one of the jars slowly. Sarah's cousin glanced over and smirked. Those looked old anyway. I carefully placed the jar back where it belonged. Then I reached for my purse sitting near the counter. Brenda frowned. "You are leaving?" she asked. "Dinner is almost ready." I turned toward her. "I think you all have everything handled." Jason stood up quickly. "Mom, wait." But I kept walking toward the front door. The cold mountain air hit my face the second I stepped outside. Behind me, the music started up again almost immediately. Like my presence had only been a brief interruption to their weekend. I sat inside my SUV, gripping the steering wheel while the cabin lights glowed through the pine trees ahead of me. Then, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text message from the realtor I had planned to meet that afternoon. "Diane, just reviewed county records before our appointment. We may need to discuss something unusual regarding the property title." I stared at the realtor's message for several long seconds before calling him back. The music from the cabin still echoed faintly through the trees while dusk settled over the mountains. "Diane," Mark Henderson said the moment he answered, his voice unusually careful. I did not want to discuss this through text, but while preparing the lease paperwork, I noticed a transfer inquiry attached to your parcel number last month. My stomach tightened. "What kind of transfer inquiry?" There was a pause. Papers shuffled on his end. "Somebody contacted the county office, asking about adding future survivorship language to the property title." I felt my grip tighten on the steering wheel. "Who?" Another pause. "The inquiry listed your son and daughter-in-law by name." For a second, I could not speak at all. The windshield in front of me blurred slightly from the cold mountain mist gathering outside. "That is not possible," I said quietly. "I never authorized anything." "No legal changes were completed," Mark explained carefully. "But somebody was clearly exploring options. Exploring options, like I was already halfway buried." I thanked him and hung up, but I did not start the engine. I just sat there listening to my own breathing, while memories started fitting together in ways I suddenly hated. Sarah asking casual questions about estate planning over Thanksgiving. Jason insisting I simplify my finances after Harold passed. Sarah offering to help organize my legal files last spring. At the time, I thought they were being thoughtful. Now every conversation felt different. I finally drove back toward the cabin because part of me still hoped there had to be some explanation. The house was louder now. More cars had arrived. String lights hung across the deck railings, like they were hosting a vacation rental party instead of invading somebody's retirement property. I walked inside, carrying the folder tightly against my chest. Sarah spotted me immediately. "There she is," she said brightly to the room. "We thought you left for the night." I looked directly at Jason. "I need to speak with you." He hesitated before following me into the hallway near the laundry room. The music muffled behind us. For the first time all evening, he looked nervous. "Mom, everybody's had a little too much wine," he muttered. "Can we not do this tonight?" I kept my voice level. "Did you and Sarah contact the county office about my property title?" His face changed instantly. Not outrage, not confusion, guilt. Jason looked down at the floor exactly the way he used to when he got caught lying as a little boy. "It was not like that," he said quietly. "Then explain it to me." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Sarah just thought maybe it would make things easier later on if the paperwork was already streamlined." Streamlined. I actually laughed once under my breath because the word sounded so clean compared to what it really meant. "Without discussing it with me?" Jason lowered his voice even further. "Mom, you have to understand. Sarah worries about stability. She thinks if something ever happened to you unexpectedly, probate could drag on for months." I stared at my son. "So your solution was to start preparing for my death behind my back?" His eyes widened immediately. "That is not fair." Before I could answer, Sarah suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway, holding 2 wine glasses. She had clearly been listening. "Nobody is planning your funeral, Diane," she said with forced patience. "We are talking about practical planning. Most parents would appreciate having responsible family members willing to step in." I looked between both of them and felt something inside me sink lower than anger. It was the realization that they had already convinced themselves they were entitled to decisions about my life. And judging by the relaxed laughter drifting through my cabin from Sarah's relatives, they had apparently been telling that story to everybody else too. Then Sarah smiled tightly and added one sentence that made the entire floor seem to disappear beneath me. "Honestly, Jason and I already assumed this place would stay in the family after the papers were updated. I left the cabin just after midnight. Nobody tried very hard to stop me." Jason followed me onto the porch for about 30 seconds while cold mountain fog rolled through the trees around us. "Mom," he said quietly, "you are taking this too personally." I remember staring at him under the yellow porch light, wondering when exactly my son had learned to speak to me like I was the difficult one for noticing betrayal. "Personally?" I repeated softly. "Jason, they went through my legal documents." He sighed heavily like he was exhausted from managing my emotions instead of the chaos inside that cabin. "Sarah just gets anxious about the future." I nodded once. "The future where I am gone?" He did not answer. That silence followed me all the way down Interstate 40 back toward Charlotte. By the time I pulled into my townhouse driveway around 3 in the morning, my phone already showed 11 missed calls and 6 text messages. Most were from Sarah, not apologizing. Managing. The first text read, "I think there has been a misunderstanding tonight." The second, "You embarrassed everyone by storming out." Then finally, "We need to discuss realistic long-term plans for the property like adults." Like adults. I sat in my dark kitchen, still wearing my coat, while the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. I could not stop thinking about how naturally they all behaved inside that cabin. Nobody acted shocked. Nobody questioned whether they belonged there, which meant this conversation had been happening long before I arrived that afternoon. The next morning, Sarah sent a long email titled, "Family Property Discussion." I opened it slowly while drinking coffee at Harold's old oak table. The email included bullet points. Actual bullet points. Maintenance burdens. Estate streamlining. Future occupancy considerations. She even attached links to articles about aging homeowners, downsizing vacation properties. One sentence sat heavier than all the others. "Jason and I are simply trying to create stability before circumstances force rush decisions later on." Circumstances. As if my life was already some approaching administrative inconvenience. Around noon, Brenda called. I almost did not answer, but I did. "Diane," she said in that fake, gentle voice people use when they think they are being reasonable. "Everybody feels terrible about the tension." I looked out the kitchen window at the rain soaking my tiny backyard garden. "That is interesting," I said quietly, "because nobody seemed uncomfortable drinking wine in my house." She laughed awkwardly. "Well, emotions were running high." Then her tone shifted slightly. "But honestly, dear, at some point properties like that naturally pass down. Sarah and Jason are just trying to think ahead responsibly." I closed my eyes for a second. There it was again. The assumption, not if. When. I ended the call politely, but my chest felt strangely hollow afterward. Over the next 3 days, the messages kept coming. Jason left 2 voicemails, asking me to sit down calmly as a family. Sarah mailed a handwritten note saying she hoped we could move past emotional misunderstandings. But none of it addressed the real thing sitting underneath everything else. Nobody denied trying to position themselves around my property. Nobody apologized for treating my life like a transition phase. By Thursday evening, the silence inside my townhouse started feeling heavier than usual. I heated up leftover soup, carried the bowl into the living room, and realized nobody had checked on me once, simply because they loved me. Every call, every email, every carefully worded message had been about the cabin. And for the first time in my life, I understood what true loneliness inside a family actually felt like. That weekend, I did not leave my townhouse once. Rain tapped softly against the windows for most of Saturday, while I moved slowly from room to room trying to make sense of the heaviness sitting inside my chest. I watered the plants Harold used to complain I overwatered. I folded laundry that did not really need folding. I reorganized kitchen drawers that were already organized. It was strange how grief could return years after a person died, but wear a completely different face. When Harold passed from cancer 8 years earlier, the grief had been sharp and obvious. People brought casseroles. Neighbors checked on me. Jason called every evening back then. But this felt quieter somehow. Smaller on the outside, worse underneath. Around 6 o'clock Saturday evening, I found myself standing in the hallway closet, holding Harold's old winter coat against my chest. It still smelled faintly like cedar and cold mountain air. I sat down on the edge of the guest bed and suddenly realized something painful. Harold had spent his final years trying to make sure I would never feel vulnerable after he was gone. Every insurance policy, every savings account, every property deed. He organized everything carefully because he knew loneliness makes older people easy to pressure. And somehow, despite all his planning, I had still slowly become emotionally cornered inside my own family. My phone buzzed again on the nightstand. Jason. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said carefully. Sarah is really upset about how distant you have been. I stared at the rain streaking down the bedroom window. Distant, I repeated quietly. Jason, your wife researched changing my property arrangements without telling me. He exhaled heavily. You keep framing it like some kind of attack. That sentence sat between us for several seconds. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding all week. Did you know they were using Harold's workshop? Silence. Long silence. Finally, he muttered. I did not think it was a big deal. I closed my eyes. That room held my husband's last unfinished projects. His handwriting was still on half the storage bins in there. And my son had watched strangers drink beer inside it like it was a game room. You know what hurts the most? I said softly. Not the cabin, not even the paperwork. It is realizing you no longer protect anything that matters to me. Jason immediately sounded defensive. That is not fair. But his voice sounded smaller now, less certain, like somewhere underneath all this, he knew I was telling the truth. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark living room without turning on any lights. Hours passed that way. Around midnight, I made myself tea and noticed my hands were finally steady again for the first time all week. That was when the realization fully settled in. I had spent years trying to preserve peace by making myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. But peace built on silence was not peace at all. It was surrender. Early Sunday morning, I walked into my home office, opened the locked filing cabinet beside my desk, and pulled out the original deed folder Harold and I signed 21 years earlier. Then I placed it carefully on the desk beside my laptop and reached for my attorney's business card. Monday morning, I met with my attorney at a quiet brick office building near downtown Charlotte. The lobby smelled faintly like coffee and lemon polish, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to calm. Not happiness, just steadiness. Walter Green had handled Harold's estate years earlier. He was in his 70s now, silver-haired, precise, the kind of man who still carried paper files instead of tablets. He adjusted his glasses while reviewing the cabin documents spread across his conference table. Legally, he said carefully, nobody can touch this property without your authorization. I nodded slowly. I know that now. He looked at me for a long moment over the top of the file. Diane. People usually do not begin discussing survivorship arrangements this aggressively, unless they already believe emotional ownership has shifted. Emotional ownership. The phrase sat heavily in my chest because it was exactly right. By the time I left his office 2 hours later, I had updated every legal document connected to the cabin. Trust language, property directives, access permissions, everything. Quietly. No speeches, no threats, just paperwork. Afterward, I drove to a small diner off Providence Road and ordered soup and coffee. I sat alone near the window watching commuters rush past in expensive coats, while soft jazz played overhead. Halfway through my lunch, my phone buzzed. Sarah. I let it ring twice before answering. Diane, she said quickly. Jason told me you met with a lawyer. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. Yes. Her voice tightened immediately. Do you really think this is necessary? I think clarity is necessary. A short silence followed. Then she lowered her voice like she was trying to sound reasonable. You are making this feel hostile. I looked out at the gray winter sky beyond the diner windows. No, Sarah. Boundaries only feel hostile to people who benefited from not having them. She did not respond for several seconds. Finally, she said stiffly, Jason is very upset. I almost answered automatically the old way. I almost softened, apologized, tried to smooth things over, but instead I simply said, Jason is a grown man. Then I ended the call. That afternoon, I stopped by the cabin management company in Asheville and finalized the long-term rental listing myself. A young woman named Emily walked me through updated photographs of the property on her computer screen. Fresh pine walls, stone fireplace, winter mountain views. For the first time in weeks, I saw the cabin through different eyes. Not as contested family territory, not as future inheritance, just mine. Mine because Harold and I built it together. Mine because we sacrificed for it. Mine because I was still alive. This place is beautiful, Emily said warmly. It is going to rent fast. I smiled faintly. It deserves people who treat it carefully. When I returned to Charlotte that evening, I carried grocery bags into the townhouse and realized something strange. The silence inside no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. I cooked salmon for dinner, opened a bottle of wine for myself, and spent an hour organizing old financial folders in the study. Around 9 that night, another message arrived from Jason. Mom, can we please talk before this goes too far? I read the text twice before setting the phone face down on the kitchen counter beside my tea. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the rental application that had just come through for the cabin. A retired couple from Vermont wanted a 6-month lease starting immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, my life became strangely quiet in the best possible way. Every morning, I woke up around 6:30, brewed coffee in Harold's old percolator, and sat by the kitchen window while winter sunlight slowly crept across the backyard fence. The retired couple from Vermont signed the lease agreement 3 days later. Their names were Eleanor and Richard Bennett. During our video call, Eleanor smiled warmly at me from behind large reading glasses and said, We have been looking for a peaceful place exactly like this. Peaceful. That word stayed with me. After the call ended, I drove back to Asheville the following Friday to prepare the cabin before the Bennetts arrived. The mountain roads were damp from overnight rain, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel dread pulling into the driveway. The cabin looked calm again, empty, breathing normally. I spent most of the afternoon opening windows, washing linens, and carefully putting Harold's workshop back in order. I rehung his old fishing hat on the hook near the workbench. I polished the oak table slowly with lemon oil until the wood glowed warmly beneath the kitchen lights. Around 4 o'clock, the local property manager, Emily, stopped by carrying a clipboard and a navy blue folder with the rental company logo stamped across the front. Everything looks wonderful, she said while walking through the cabin. Honestly, Diane, you have one of the best maintained properties in the county. I laughed softly under my breath because nobody in my family had spoken to me like I was capable in a very long time. Emily handed me an owner packet that included updated lease documents, maintenance schedules, and emergency contact cards, with my name printed neatly across the top beside the title Property Owner. Such a small thing, just black letters on cream-colored cardstock. But seeing my name there stirred something steady inside me. Not ego, recognition. I had spent years quietly handling taxes, insurance renewals, repairs, contractor schedules, septic inspections, roof maintenance, all the invisible work that allowed everybody else to treat the cabin like magic instead of labor. And suddenly I realized I had built an entire life around minimizing my own competence so other people could feel comfortable taking from it. Emily smiled while checking the thermostat settings. You know, she said casually, most owners your age hand everything off to their children by now. It is refreshing seeing someone so organized. I adjusted the stack of folded towels in my arms and answered calmly. People tend to underestimate older women until they need something handled correctly. She laughed softly. That is probably true. Before leaving, I walked out onto the back porch overlooking the mountains. The air smelled like pine and cold earth. Down below, Fog drifted slowly through the valley while evening lights flickered on in distant cabins scattered across the hillsides. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Jason again. I stared at the screen for several seconds before finally opening the message. Mom, Sarah, and I drove by the cabin today. Why were strangers there? I slipped the phone back into my pocket without answering right away. Then I looked through the front window where Eleanor Bennett was already inside, arranging flowers she had brought for the kitchen table. And standing there in the fading mountain light, I realized something important. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt like a place where I was slowly disappearing. 3 days later, Jason showed up at my townhouse, unannounced just after 7 in the evening. I was in the kitchen slicing lemons for iced tea when I heard his knock. Not pounding, just sharp enough to tell me he was anxious. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. His coat was wrinkled, his eyes heavy like he had not been sleeping much. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to come home from school, nervous about report cards. But then he spoke. "Mom, we need to talk." I stepped aside quietly and let him in. The house smelled faintly like rosemary chicken roasting in the oven. Jason looked around almost awkwardly, like he had forgotten what calm felt like inside these walls. "You rented the cabin out?" he asked finally. I set the knife down beside the cutting board. "Yes." He blinked hard. "Without telling us?" I almost smiled at the irony of that question. Instead, I walked to the refrigerator and poured tea into 2 glasses. "You mean the same cabin I legally own?" He rubbed his forehead. "That is not the point." I handed him a glass calmly. "Then explain the point to me, Jason." He looked down into the iced tea for several seconds before speaking again. "Sarah is furious. Her parents already planned another trip up there next month." There it was. Not concern about me, not apology. Logistics. Entitlement disrupted. I sat across from him at the kitchen table Harold built 30 years ago. "The cabin is occupied now," I said evenly. "It is no longer available for casual family use." Jason's jaw tightened slightly. "You are making this feel transactional." I folded my hands quietly in my lap. "No, I am making it clear." He leaned back heavily in the chair. "Sarah thinks you are punishing us." The old version of me would have rushed to deny that, tried to comfort him. But now I simply answered honestly. "Jason, boundaries are not punishment." The kitchen went quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock over the pantry. Finally, he looked up at me directly for the first time in weeks. "Things have gotten really tense between Sarah and her parents because of this." I nodded once. "I imagine they have." He looked frustrated by my calmness more than anything else, like he kept expecting emotional chaos he could negotiate around. Instead, he was sitting across from a woman who had quietly stopped asking permission to protect herself. "Mom," he said more softly now, "do you really think we were trying to hurt you?" That question sat heavily between us. I thought about Harold's workshop, the paperwork, the county inquiry, the way everyone behaved inside that cabin before I interrupted their assumptions. "I think," I answered carefully, "that somewhere along the way you all stopped seeing me as a person with a future of my own." Jason stared at the table after that. Long silence. Then quietly, almost under his breath, he admitted something that made my stomach tighten again. Sarah already told her family the cabin would eventually stay with us. I did not react outwardly. I simply reached for my tea and took one slow sip while Jason continued staring down at the wood grain of the table. And in that moment, I realized there was still one thing he had not figured out yet. He still believed the cabin was the most important asset Harold and I had protected all these years. Jason came back 2 nights later, but this time, Sarah came with him. I could tell from the second I opened the door that she was trying very hard to appear calm. She wore a cream-colored wool coat, expensive boots, perfectly styled hair. Every detail controlled the way she always liked things controlled. But her eyes kept moving around the townhouse nervously, like she no longer understood the rules inside it. "We just want to clear the air," she said quickly before I even invited them in. I stepped aside anyway. The dining table was already set with teacups and a small plate of lemon cookies. Not because I was trying to comfort them, simply because this was still my home, and I refused to let tension turn me into somebody bitter. Sarah sat stiffly at the table while Jason hovered beside the window with his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Sarah leaned forward. Diane, I think this situation has gotten way out of proportion. I folded my napkin carefully beside my teacup. Interesting, I said calmly, because from where I am sitting, the only thing that changed is that I stopped saying yes automatically. Her jaw tightened slightly. You know that is not fair. I looked directly at her. Then tell me what part feels unfair. The part where I rented my own property? Or the part where I protected my legal documents after discovering people discussing future ownership without me? Jason stepped in quickly. Mom, nobody was trying to steal anything. I nodded once. No, you just became very comfortable planning around my existence. Silence settled heavily across the table. Sarah crossed her arms. You are acting like we treated you as disposable. I did not raise my voice. You treated my future like an administrative step. That landed harder than yelling ever could have. Sarah looked away first. Jason rubbed both hands over his face, again the way he always did when he could not control the direction of a conversation. Then he finally asked the question they had clearly come to ask all along. What exactly changed with the legal paperwork? I reached calmly toward the sideboard beside the dining room wall and picked up a dark blue folder. Both of them watched closely now. I placed the folder gently on the table between us. Harold and I updated our estate structure years ago after his diagnosis. I explained quietly. The cabin was never the primary protected asset. Sarah frowned immediately. What does that mean? I opened the folder and slid several papers across the table toward them. Jason stared down first, then his entire face changed. Not anger. Shock. Real shock. Mom, he whispered. Sarah grabbed the top document quickly and began scanning it. I watched the color slowly drain from her face. Harold and I had created a conservation trust nearly a decade earlier, tied to multiple investment accounts, land rights adjoining the cabin property, and a substantial survivor portfolio neither of them knew existed. The cabin itself was only one piece of it. And according to the updated legal structure finalized that week, every single asset now required strict conditions for inheritance eligibility. Sarah looked up sharply. You changed this? I met her eyes steadily. No, I protected it. Jason kept staring at the paperwork like he no longer recognized the woman sitting across from him. Then quietly, almost painfully, he asked the one thing I do not think he ever imagined he would have to ask his own mother. How much of this were you handling by yourself all these years? The room stayed completely silent after Jason asked that question. Even the old wall clock above the dining room archway suddenly sounded louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Sarah slowly lowered the papers back onto the table, like they had become physically heavier in her hands. I folded mine carefully in my lap before answering. All of it? I said quietly. Jason stared at me. What do you mean all of it? I looked toward the kitchen window where rain had started falling softly against the glass again. The trust management, the land agreements, the investment renewals, the insurance restructuring after Harold got sick, the cabin taxes, the portfolio balancing, every bit of it. Sarah blinked hard. But Jason said the cabin was mostly sentimental. I gave a faint, tired smile. That was probably easier for everyone to believe. Jason leaned back in his chair slowly like the air had left his lungs. Mom, why did you never tell me any of this? I looked at my son carefully because the answer was not dramatic. It was simple. Because I did not raise you to monitor my value based on assets. That landed hard. I could see it in his face immediately. Sarah looked down at the paperwork again, this time differently. Not with entitlement, with calculation unraveling in real time. The Conservation Trust, she said quietly, almost to herself. That is why the county inquiry never went anywhere. I nodded once. Harold and I designed it specifically to prevent outside pressure and rushed inheritance decisions after one of us passed. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. You make it sound like we were trying to manipulate you. I held her gaze calmly. No, your behavior made it sound that way. Jason rubbed both hands over his face again, before finally whispering, Jesus. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Sarah straightened slightly in her chair and tried one final, softer approach. Diane, I know things got messy, but we are still family. I looked at her quietly for a moment. Family should make people feel safer, I said gently, not managed. That sentence seemed to drain the fight out of the room completely. Jason stared down at the trust papers spread across the table while Sarah sat rigid beside him, suddenly unsure of her place in a situation she thought she already understood. Finally, I stood up and began gathering the documents back into the blue folder one page at a time. Calmly, carefully, the sound of paper sliding against paper filled the silence. Jason looked up quickly. "Mom, what happens now?" I paused before answering. "Now," I said evenly, "the cabin remains leased. The trust remains unchanged. And from this point forward, nobody accesses my financial or legal records without my direct permission." Sarah opened her mouth slightly, like she wanted to argue. But no words came out, because for the first time since all of this started, the boundaries were no longer emotional. They were structural, real. I walked the folder back to the sideboard and locked it inside the bottom drawer. When I turned around again, Jason was watching me differently. Not as somebody fragile, not as somebody fading quietly into the background of his adult life. He looked at me the way Harold used to during difficult moments. Like he was finally remembering who I actually was. But even then, something unfinished still hung in the room between all of us. Because trust, once damaged slowly over years, does not return in a single conversation no matter how calm the voices become. Spring arrived slowly that year in the Blue Ridge Mountains. By late March, the dogwoods had started blooming along the winding roads near the cabin, and tiny patches of green pushed through the cold earth around the porch steps Harold built with his own hands more than 2 decades earlier. Life did not magically become perfect after that night at my dining table. Jason and I still moved carefully around each other for a while, like two people learning a new language after years of misunderstanding. Sarah became quieter, more distant at first. Then, eventually more respectful. Though not because of speeches or guilt, because boundaries finally existed where assumptions used to live. And strangely enough, once everything became clear, the constant tension began fading on its own. A few weeks later, Jason asked if he could meet me at the cabin alone. No Sarah. No relatives. Just him. We sat on the back porch early one Saturday morning, drinking coffee, while fog rolled softly through the valley below us. He looked older somehow. Not physically, just emotionally worn down. "I did not realize how much pressure you carried all these years," he admitted quietly while staring out toward the trees. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug to keep them warm against the mountain air. "Most people do not notice invisible work until it disappears," I answered softly. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he finally said something I think both of us needed to hear. "I am sorry I stopped seeing you clearly." That sentence did not erase everything. Real healing never happens that way. But it mattered, because accountability spoken honestly sounds very different from excuses disguised as peacekeeping. Later that afternoon, we walked into Harold's workshop together for the first time since all of this happened. Jason stood quietly near the old workbench, running his fingers across a row of labeled hardware drawers in his father's handwriting. "I should have protected this place better," he whispered. I looked around the room slowly. The sunlight coming through the workshop windows landed softly across the tools. The fishing poles, the unfinished cedar shelf Harold never got to complete before he passed away. "You still can," I told him gently. The cabin remained leased through summer, and honestly, I think that saved all of us. Distance gave everyone room to think, to grow up a little emotionally, to stop treating love like ownership. And as for me, I stopped apologizing for protecting my peace. I traveled more that year. I joined a financial literacy volunteer group for widows in Charlotte. I even started hosting small Sunday dinners again, but only with people who left me feeling lighter instead of smaller. One evening near the end of summer, Eleanor Bennett mailed me a handwritten card from Vermont after their lease ended. Inside, she wrote one sentence that brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you for creating a home that still feels loved." I kept that card tucked inside Harold's old recipe box beside the kitchen window. Because in the end, that was what this whole story was really about. Not property, not money, not inheritance. It was about remembering that your value does not decrease just because other people become comfortable benefiting from your silence. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for the people around you is finally say no calmly enough that everyone understands you mean it. And if you are listening to my story tonight while carrying your own quiet heartbreak inside your chest, I want you to hear this clearly. Protecting yourself does not make you selfish. Listening to your instincts does not make you cruel. God, or maybe just life itself, gives us discomfort for a reason sometimes. Not to destroy us, to wake us up before we disappear inside somebody else's expectations. Please protect your finances, protect your name, protect your peace, but most importantly, protect the part of yourself that still knows you deserve dignity, even when people around you forget it. My name is Diane Whitmore. I am 68 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never hand people so much access to your kindness that they begin confusing it for ownership over your life. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly. If even one part of it made you feel a little less alone tonight, then sharing it was worth it. And if this story spoke to your heart, I would love for you to leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you most. You can also subscribe gently if you would like to spend more evenings together, listening to stories about healing, boundaries, family, and quiet strength. Somewhere out there, another person is probably carrying the same invisible pain you once carried, and your words might help them hold on a little longer. And before you go tonight, there are more stories waiting for you in this playlist. Stories about families, betrayal, resilience, and the quiet moments that change people forever. If this journey touched something deep in you, I think the next story might too. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we are not the only ones learning how to reclaim ourselves. And maybe that is how healing really begins, one quiet story at a time.